The morning air was cold, damp with the weight of silence. A group of German generals, once men who had commanded entire armies across Europe, now shuffled forward under the watch of American guards. Their boots struck the earth with a rhythm that should have echoed confidence. Yet each step dragged like a chain. Their heads were bowed, their shoulders heavy, as if the medals and decorations that once gleamed proudly on their uniforms had turned to iron weights of shame. For them, this was the walk of finality, a march not of triumph, but of humiliation. Every breath they drew tasted like the end. The guards said little, rifles clutched firmly, eyes fixed. They escorted the prisoners toward what the generals believed to be their place of execution. Some whispered prayers in their native tongue, their lips trembling with words half remembered from childhood. Others clenched their jaws, refusing to grant the Americans the satisfaction of seeing fear. Yet, even among the proudest, the silence of the march was unbearable, for men who once dictated the fate of nations. This was the cruelest irony, condemned to die in obscurity, remembered only as vanquished relics of a broken cause. One of the generals, General Wilhelm von Blomberg, thought of his family estate in Prussia. His diary, later confiscated, recorded this chilling reflection: I expected death by bullet, not by shame. To be led like cattle, to hear nothing but the sound of boots and the rattling of weapons, I wondered which was heavier, the thought of pain or the weight of dishonor. The road narrowed as they reached an open ground. A row of wooden posts stood upright in the distance, rough-hewn and sinister, the kind of sight that needed no explanation. To the generals, the meaning was clear: this was the place. The earth here seemed darker, scarred with shallow trenches where others might have fallen. The wind carried with it the metallic scent of old gunfire. Or perhaps it was only their imagination, sharpened by fear. One officer muttered under his breath, his voice trembling, "So this is how the Reich ends." His comrade offered no reply, but something about the scene was strange. No execution squad had assembled, no blindfolds were prepared. The Americans seemed calm, methodical, but not with the tense energy of men about to kill. Instead, a different sound drifted faintly from beyond the horizon, a cadence of voices, distant yet synchronized, rising and falling like a heartbeat. It was not the sound of death. It was the sound of soldiers at drill. The generals exchanged quick, bewildered glances, though none dared speak. Their hearts pounded, expecting the crack of rifles at any moment. Yet as the guards tightened formation around them, the steps did not halt at the posts. The prisoners were turned aside, guided toward the source of the voices. Confusion rippled through their ranks. The anticipation of death had been absolute, unshakable, and now, with each step away from the execution ground, that certainty began to fracture. The march that began as a path to the firing squad was not an ending, after all. It was the beginning of something none of them had imagined. They halted abruptly. Dust rose around their boots, catching in the pale morning light. The German generals braced themselves for the command they expected: the final order, the word that would bring rifles to shoulders and bodies to the ground. Instead, the American officer in charge stepped forward with calm precision. His voice, when it came, was firm but strangely devoid of cruelty. No execution. He said, "Take them to observe the parade." The words struck harder than any bullet. For a moment, the Germans thought they had misheard. A few raised their heads sharply, their eyes wide with disbelief. What kind of command was this execution they understood, humiliation they had prepared for? But to be marched past the posts and told to watch a parade, this was beyond comprehension. Their world had no script for mercy dressed as spectacle. General Friedrich Dollmann, who had led divisions across France, recorded in his confiscated notebook, "Later, I was prepared for death." My pulse slowed as we reached the posts, but when I heard the Americans speak, it raced again. Death had order. This confusion was unbearable. The guards shifted formation, turning the prisoners away from the posts and onto a wider path that led toward an open field. From the distance, the sound that had seemed faint and rhythmic now grew louder, voices chanting in cadence, boots striking the ground in thunderous unison. It was not chaos. It was not improvisation. It was precision, deliberate and overwhelming. Some of the generals whispered among themselves, their words sharp and bitter. "This is humiliation." One hissed. Another muttered, No, this is something else. Their debate cut off as they approached the field, where lines of American soldiers stretched farther than the eye could measure. There was a strange cruelty in the American order. The Germans had expected bullets and oblivion. Instead, they were forced to witness a demonstration of discipline, a spectacle of order and strength that carried its own form of torment. To live. But to live with the memory of what they saw, that was perhaps the harsher sentence. Colonel Hans Krebs clenched his fists so tightly the knuckles went white. He had believed, until that very morning, that Germany's army was the finest in the world. Watching the endless ranks of Americans drill, he began to doubt not only his nation, but the very foundation of what he had fought for. His letter home, never delivered, contained the line, "They did not kill us. They showed us something worse, the certainty that we were already defeated." In that moment, the generals realized they had been spared not out of kindness, but to witness a revelation. Execution would have silenced them. This, however, would leave them alive, haunted, shaken, and carrying a testimony the world would one day hear. The unimaginable order had transformed the ground beneath their feet. The execution field had become a classroom, and they, unwilling students, were about to learn a lesson that would burn deeper than any wound. The generals were herded closer, their boots crunching on gravel as the distant rhythm swelled into a deafening roar. What they had once mistaken for the approach of execution, fire revealed itself as the pulse of an army in motion. The parade ground stretched vast and open before them, flanked by American banners that rippled in the breeze. Beneath those flags, battalions of U.S. soldiers marched in formation so vast it seemed endless, a human tide of discipline and strength. For men who had commanded the Wehrmacht, this transformation was unbearable to watch. The very ground where they thought their lives would end was now alive with the thunder of organized power. Death had been postponed, but humiliation had sharpened. They were no longer condemned men, but forced witnesses to something more lasting than a bullet, the spectacle of American might. The cadence rang out with precision, each shout crashing like a hammer, up 2, 3, 4. Thousands of boots struck the soil in perfect unison, a sound so steady it felt mechanical, like the pistons of a giant engine. The Germans had studied America through propaganda, dismissing it as a land of comfort and decadence. Now their eyes betrayed them. This was no disorganized rabble. This was a machine of flesh and will. General Kurt von Tippelskirch, who once commanded in Italy, muttered bitterly to himself. He remembered Berlin's proud marches along Unter den Linden, where Nazi banners draped from every facade. Yet even in those orchestrated parades, there had always been an edge of fragility, exhausted soldiers pushed beyond limits, precision bought with cruelty. Here, by contrast, the Americans moved with a confidence that seemed effortless, sustained not by fear, but by rhythm and unity. A diary entry from another prisoner, General Walter von Reichenau, later revealed, "At first I thought it theater, but then I saw their faces. They were not straining. They were not broken. They marched because they believed in something. And I, who had led men into slaughter, felt a hollowness deeper than fear." The shock was not only visual, it was numerical. On one side of the field, an American officer briefed a visiting journalist. "This is a single division, 20,000 strong, by month's end. 3 more divisions will complete training here." The German prisoners overheard. Their minds spun with arithmetic. 20,000 here, 60,000 in weeks. Factories producing rifles, tanks, and bombers at a pace Germany could not dream of. The numbers were staggering, and they stung like lashes across pride already battered. A colonel among them whispered, "If this is one training ground, how many more exist across America?" The question hung heavy. The silence that followed was more damning than any answer. The march of death had turned into a march of revelation. The generals, who had braced for the sudden impact of bullets, now endured something slower, heavier, more corrosive, the dawning realization that the Reich's destiny was not to end in heroic sacrifice, but in the cold mathematics of overwhelming force and flawless order. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the parade ground as the Americans shifted from steady marching to maneuvers that displayed not only rhythm, but strategy. Commands barked out by officers carried over the field, crisp and sharp, instantly obeyed by thousands of voices in boots. What stunned the German generals was not simply the order itself, it was the spirit infused within it. The formations flexed, pivoted, expanded, shorect, and contracted with fluid precision. Every soldier knew his place. Every movement flowed as if one body, one will. To the Germans, this was more than spectacle. It was revelation. For years, they had been told that Americans were clumsy, soft, incapable of true discipline. Nazi propaganda painted them as weak consumers, distracted by jazz, cinema, and abundance. Yet here, under the glaring sun, was proof that such images had been lies. The United States had not only raised an army, it had forged a symbol of power that surpassed even the mythic strength the Wehrmacht once claimed for itself. General Wilhelm von Blomberg, who had kept silent for most of the ordeal, could no longer suppress his thoughts. He leaned toward a fellow officer and muttered, "This is not drilled through terror. It is drilled through belief." The words carried bitterness, but also a reluctant awe. Later, his confiscated notes revealed more. "We feared their weapons. Now we fear their unity. If they march like this, they fight like this. And if they fight like this, Germany is already defeated." The Americans seemed aware of their audience. Without looking directly at the generals, they marched with a confidence that carried its own message. You are watching what victory looks like. The generals were not shot, not silenced. They were forced to see, to absorb, to reckon. One American sergeant leading a platoon shouted above the cadence, his voice carrying with raw energy, "Forward, march." The lines surged ahead, rifles gleaming under the sunlight. The sound of synchronized steps shook the ground like artillery. The Germans, once masters of blitzkrieg, now stood powerless, their pride breaking under the thunder of another army's discipline. The gossip among the prisoners shifted. Earlier, they had whispered of death, of last words and honor. Now, their whispers carried confusion, even fear. "Look at their faces," one colonel said under his breath. "They are not afraid. They are not exhausted. They are eager." Another spat into the dirt, muttering, "An army that enjoys marching, that is an army no one can defeat." Numbers reinforced the vision. Over 16 million Americans would eventually serve during the war. By 1944, U.S. industry produced 96,000 aircraft, 17 million rifles, and enough food to feed not only their troops, but much of Europe. These statistics, circulating quietly among the generals through intercepted reports, were now embodied before their eyes. The scale of American might was no longer abstract. It was flesh, voice, and motion. The image of the troops, banners snapping above them, echoed with symbolism. Victory here was not about brute weapons alone. It was about a system that could harness millions into harmony. To the defeated generals, that harmony was more terrifying than any execution squad. The parade slowed, then ended with a final roar of voices that rolled across the field like thunder retreating into the distance. Dust hung in the air, shimmering in the sunlight, settling slowly over the rows of prisoners who stood in stunned silence. For the German generals, the performance had ended, but the wound it left was only beginning to cut. Moments earlier, many of these men had thought themselves prepared for death. Death would have been clean, decisive, even dignified in a perverse sense. Yet now they faced something far more corrosive, the undeniable collapse of their arrogance. The Wehrmacht, the pride of Hitler's Reich, had long believed itself the pinnacle of modern military power. Now, before their weary eyes, that illusion cracked apart like brittle glass. General Friedrich Dollmann stared at the departing columns, his lips pressed tight. In his confiscated diary, he later wrote, "They did not fire at us. Instead, they fired through us. Every synchronized step struck harder than a bullet. I realized that our invincibility was nothing more than a story we had told ourselves." The humiliation was magnified by gossip within their own ranks. One general, pale and shaken, muttered, "Berlin lied to us. They said Americans could never field such an army." Another whispered bitterly, "We thought we were watching amateurs. Instead, we watched the future." Their words, soft and broken, spread through the group like cracks in stone. And the silence, the silence was perhaps the loudest testimony of all. Generals once famed for their speeches, For the booming orders they had barked to divisions of men could not summon even a sentence of defiance now. They had no language for what they had seen. Arrogance had left them. What remained was the hollow stare of men who knew they had been surpassed not only in numbers and weapons, but in spirit. For years, German propaganda had mocked American diversity as weakness. Yet here, on the parade ground, they had seen white and black soldiers drilling side by side, laughing together during breaks, then falling instantly into flawless discipline at command. That vision alone unsettled them. One general whispered, almost in disbelief, "They fight as one. Even with men we would never allow to hold a rifle." The words betrayed the narrow world they came from, a world that now seemed already buried by history. At this point, dear viewers, pause and consider if you stood where those generals stood, what would you have felt? Would you have feared the rifles that never fired, or the army that marched in their place? Tell me in the comments, because history is not only written in books, it is carried in how we imagine ourselves standing in those moments. The Americans had spared their lives, but not their pride. Death would have been simpler. Instead, the generals carried away a knowledge too sharp to forget Germany had been defeated not just by tanks and bombers, but by an idea of unity they had never believed possible. When the generals were marched back from the parade ground, they carried not relief, but a heavy silence. Each step was no longer weighed down by the fear of imminent death, but by the unbearable knowledge of what they had seen. The posts they once thought would end their lives now faded into irrelevance. The real execution had already taken place inside their pride. Later, in the barracks, words began to surface. Some men scribbled hurried notes into confiscated diaries. Others whispered into the dark, their voices tinged with disbelief. General Hans Krebs, who had once sat in Hitler's war councils, later confessed to a fellow prisoner, "We were ready for bullets." Instead, they showed us their truth, not with rifles, but with order. That line, retold by guards and eventually by historians, spread far beyond the camp. It became a fragment of living testimony, repeated as if it were a crack in the very wall of Nazi propaganda. The story carried a strange electricity. American officers themselves seemed to understand the symbolic weight of what had happened. No propaganda leaflet, no speech could have been more effective than forcing enemy commanders to witness a display that contradicted everything they had believed. A firing squad would have silenced them. A parade forced them to speak, to confess in letters and diaries that discipline and unity had crushed them more thoroughly than weapons. One prisoner, General Walter von Reichenau, scrawled on a torn scrap of paper, "They did not kill us. They forced us to live with the truth." Those words were intercepted and later reported in Allied intelligence briefings, circulated as evidence that America's strength lay not only in production, but in the psychological battlefield. Whispers from the camp soon made their way into larger conversations. Journalists who interviewed guards reported gossip of broken generals, men who stared into space during meals, too stunned even to eat. One American sergeant noted in his own letter home, "They looked like ghosts, not because we spared them, but because we showed them who we are." The confession that traveled farthest came from a general who, after the war, repeated his memory to a German journalist. "We expected death. Instead, America gave us a lesson. We saw a power greater than weapons. We saw belief." His words were later published in fragments, sparking debate in post-war Europe about how a democracy, once dismissed as weak, had broken the myth of Nazi invincibility. And so I must ask you, watching this now, what do you think shattered them most? Was it the sheer numbers, the endless boots striking the earth? Or was it the realization that an open society had built a stronger army than their dictatorship ever could? Leave your thoughts below, because these questions are not only about the past, they are mirrors for our present. The testimony of these broken men outlived the war itself. It became part of the record. A whisper turned into history, proving that the greatest weapon America wielded was not revenge, but discipline made visible. Night fell slowly over the camp. Floodlights flickered on, throwing long white beams across the fences and parade ground where only hours before the earth had thundered with marching boots. The German generals, escorted back to their quarters, turned their heads one last time. Behind the wire, the American flags still rippled in the wind, illuminated against the dark. Their shadows stretched thin across the ground. reminders of men who had walked to death and returned, carrying something heavier than any chain, the vision of their enemy's strength. No words were exchanged. For commanders who once barked orders to hundreds of thousands, silence now became their only language. Each man wrestled with the same torment, how to reconcile the myths they had believed with the reality they had witnessed. Pride had been shattered, not by gunfire, but by a demonstration of unity and discipline that would haunt them long after the war ended. Later, scattered accounts confirmed the depth of this moment. A guard remembered General Friedrich Dollmann staring out at the lights, whispering in broken English, "Not guns, not bombs." This, another officer, in a confiscated note, confessed. "We lost the war the moment we saw them march." These words, preserved in fragments, became quiet confessions of defeat far more powerful than any battlefield report. For the Americans, the message was deliberate. They had not staged a parade for spectacle alone. They had staged a lesson. To the defeated generals, it was humiliation. To the United States, it was proof that its strength lay not in vengeance but in discipline, not in cruelty but in demonstration. The soldiers marching on that field did more than drill. They carried the burden of showing the world why America would emerge from the war not only victorious but unshaken in its ideals. This story passed into history as a symbol. It told the world that power is not always shown by execution, but sometimes by restraint. That true victory lies not in silencing enemies, but in forcing them to see a truth they can never unsee. And in that sense, America's legacy was forged not only in steel and fire, but in moments like this, moments where prideful enemies were compelled to bow their heads before a vision of discipline they could never match. Generals who had once dreamed of empires now became unwilling witnesses to something greater than conquest, a civilization proving its strength without pulling a single trigger. That is why, long after the war's end, this story remained a quiet but enduring testament to the kind of power that makes nations stand tall, not just in battle, but in memory. When the war finally ended and the years turned quietly toward rebuilding, the memory of that day on the parade ground did not fade. It lived on in fragments of diaries, in letters never delivered, in confessions murmured decades later by men who once carried banners of conquest for the German generals. The firing squad they expected never came. Instead, they carried home an image far more enduring, the thunder of American boots and the unshakable unity of an army built on belief rather than fear. History often remembers wars through numbers: millions of soldiers mobilized, tens of thousands of aircraft produced, entire cities reduced to rubble. Yet within those vast statistics lie moments of piercing intimacy, when the scale of power is revealed not in destruction, but in discipline. That morning, under the rising sun, a handful of defeated men learned that the might of the United States was not only measured in factories or weapons, but in the harmony of ordinary soldiers moving as one. Some of those generals lived to see Germany rebuilt, to walk city streets no longer marked by banners of hate, but by markets, schools, and homes rising from ruins. Perhaps they remembered, in quiet hours, the cadence of voices they once heard, the steady rhythm of a parade that had spoken louder than bullets. One former officer, in later life, admitted he still dreamed of it, the sound of boots striking the ground, echoing like a heartbeat that never left him. For America, that legacy was lasting. It was proof that the strength of a free nation lay not in cruelty, but in confidence, not in vengeance, but in vision. And for us, listening now, it is a reminder that power is never only about the weapons a nation wields. It is about the ideals that give those weapons meaning, the unity that binds men and women to a common cause, and the discipline that endures long after the guns fall silent. The floodlights dim, the shadows fade, and the night takes back the parade ground. Yet the lesson remains. Lingering like an echo across time, sometimes the greatest victories are won not by taking lives, but by changing them.